In a continuation of our series on POW and internment camps in World War II, we are going to look at an often overlooked but tragic decision that the United States made in the war: the internment of Japanese American civilians across the country.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. In what would become known as a day that would live in infamy, 2,403 Americans would be killed in the surprise attack. As the nation reeled, Americans were desperate for revenge and justice. A wave of anti-Japanese attitudes swept the country, and the 120,000 people living in the U.S. with Japanese ancestry quickly found themselves surrounded by a nation who resented them. Meanwhile, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration grew suspicious of potential spies and saboteurs inside American borders. These attitudes and fears continued to grow as Imperial Japan found victory on the battlefield. By 1941, the Japanese had been fighting for 4 years in their massive war against the Chinese and other Asian nations. Their military was battle-hardened and extremely effective. Their expansion into the Philippines and victories in Guam and Malaya further strengthened anti-Japanese sentiments across the United States. This new powerful enemy was deeply hated by the Americans, and the innocent Japanese Americans would soon suffer the hate of the nation. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. On the basis of preventing threats to national security, the executive order allowed the military to establish, quote, military areas. Sadly, this executive order led to the military forcibly relocating nearly every single individual with Japanese ancestry in the United States mainland. The government hoped to use these individuals as farm labor, but states in the interior of the country were highly resistant to having Japanese Americans move onto their land. Anti-Japanese racism was extremely prevalent across the country, and many states were afraid that an increase in Japanese Americans would lead to violence. With no states accepting Japanese Americans, the federal government decided to construct relocation centers across the country. At first, the government tried requesting that the Japanese people voluntarily go to these centers. Obviously, that was not something that they wanted to do, so the government made it mandatory. Japanese families had only a few days to move their families to temporary assembly centers. They were forced to leave their homes, their friends, their jobs, and almost all of their possessions. Many would lose their homes forever. The beginning of this massive nationwide relocation program resulted in the complete upheaval of all of the Japanese lives. As these families began to appear at the temporary assembly centers, they were appalled by their conditions. Many of these centers were quickly built, and the living conditions were horrible. Some centers were built into horse racing tracks, and whole families would be forced to live in an empty horse stall with nothing but dirt floors. While the families made the best of their new terrible living facilities, the government's War Relocation Authority rushed to build 10 more permanent relocation facilities around the country. These relocation facilities looked exactly like what you would imagine POW camps to look like. They were built in an army barrack style and were surrounded by a massive fence with barbed wire on top. There were guard towers surrounding the camp to prevent any Japanese person from escaping. Most of these camps were built in the western part of the United States. During the summer, the heat was unbearable, and the barracks were cramped with multiple families sharing one building. During the winter, it was freezing, and the cheaply built facilities did little to protect them from the elements. Remember, as we discussed the conditions of these camps, these people were innocent. They had committed no crime, and many of them were American citizens being treated like enemies of the state. They were locked up simply because of their race. Life in the camps were miserable, but the Japanese people tried their best to make it work. They began turning the camps into functioning towns, trying their best to forget the barbed wire and guard towers keeping them imprisoned. They built schools, fire departments, police forces, newspapers. They had proms, yearbooks, markets, sports, clubs, and even churches. Despite their current situation, they built a life in these camps, and they functioned as little towns. The Japanese people would spend almost 3 years locked away in these camps. What is really remarkable about these people is that despite their nation hating them and their freedom being stripped from them, many would volunteer to fight for the U.S. and were shipped to Europe to fight the Nazis. In 1943, the U.S. government approached the Japanese internment camps and began administering so-called loyalty tests. The government asked every Japanese American in the camps 2 questions. Would they reject allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, and would they be willing to serve in the U.S. military? This test infuriated many Japanese Americans, who were enraged as being treated as enemies of the state, despite their citizenship status, and had never shown loyalty to the Emperor of Japan in the first place. In protest, many Japanese Americans simply responded, "No," to both questions. These Americans would be taken from their families and shipped to another camp intended to house disloyal Japanese Americans. However, many Japanese said yes to both and were enlisted in the U.S. Army. By the end of the war, 33,000 Japanese men and women volunteered to aid in the U.S. military in their war against Germany. 20,000 Japanese men would directly fight in the U.S. Army. Many of these Japanese men would go on to be decorated war heroes that proved excellent in combat. For example, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was a segregated Japanese American unit that today is remembered as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. This one unit collected over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 560 Silver Star medals, and 21 Medals of Honor and 7 Presidential Unit citations. Despite most of these soldiers having their entire family locked in an American internment camp, they fought hard to prove their allegiance to their country and to defeat the Nazis. This is one reason why their motto would be, quote, "going for broke." The internment of Japanese civilians ended on December 17, 1944. As the Japanese returned home, they often found their homes sold, their businesses gone, their jobs lost, and their lives changed forever. Further challenges like alien land laws in California, Oregon, and Washington prevented many Japanese people from owning their pre-war homes and farms. In all, the Japanese civilians lost over $400 million worth of property during their imprisonment. In 1948, Congress provided $38 million in reparations, and 40 years later paid an additional $20,000 to every Japanese internment victim that still lived. On December 7, 1991, the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, President George H.W. Bush said, quote, "In remembering, it is important to come to grips with the past. No nation can fully understand itself or find its place in the world if it does not look with clear eyes at all the glories and disgraces of its past. We in the United States acknowledge such an injustice in our history. The internment of Americans of Japanese ancestry was a great injustice, and it will never be repeated."